Welcome to the Sleepy Cat Library. Tonight, we are going to follow one of the oldest and most comforting foods in human life, bread. We will move gently from wild grains and stone tools to ancient ovens, Egyptian bakeries, Roman loaves, medieval village bread, sliced supermarket bread, and the quiet little world of sourdough starter resting on us. Turn off those pesky lights, grab a warm blanket, settle in, and begin. Bread looks simple when it is sitting on a wooden board. A loaf, a flat round. A torn piece beside a bowl of soup, a warm slice with a little butter melting into it. It is so familiar that it almost disappears into daily life. The way a cup disappears into the hand, or a doorway disappears because we have walked through it 1,000 times. But bread is not simple. Bread is a chain of discoveries. Someone had to notice that a wild grass held edible seeds. Someone had to gather enough of those seeds to matter. Someone had to dry them, pound them, grind them, mix them with water, shape them, heat them, and wait. At some point, a paste became a cake. A cake became something crisp at the edge and soft at the center. Later, a dough was left alone and came back changed, airy and alive with invisible fermentation. Much later, mills, markets, bakeries, guilds, factories, and paper-wrapped loaves would gather around the same basic mystery. Grass could become food, stone could become flour, water could become dough, fire could make it lasting, and time, especially in sourdough, could make it rise. This is why bread is such a good subject for a sleepy history. It belongs to kitchens and empires, to farm fields and monasteries, to hunger and celebration. It can be ordinary enough to eat with one hand, and important enough to be weighed, taxed, traded, blessed, rationed, regulated, and remembered. Tonight, we will keep the evidence honest. When a date is clear, we will use it. When a claim is uncertain, we will say so. And when we talk about recipes later, we will be careful. Those modern recipes are not exact ancient recipes unless the sources truly support that claim. They are home-safe ways to feel some of the older techniques with modern ingredients and modern care. So, we begin before loaves, before ovens as we imagine them, before wheat fields and meat rows. We begin with seeds, and seeds are small enough to be overlooked. That is part of their mystery. A seed can sit in the palm like dust, and yet inside it is a future landscape. A field is hidden in it. A harvest is hidden in it. A village granary is hidden in it. The smell of baking is hidden in it. 1,000 breakfasts are hidden in it, waiting for soil, water, sun, and human attention. Bread begins where attention becomes patient. Someone has to bend down. Someone has to notice that the dry heads of grass are worth gathering. Someone has to know when they are ready. Too early, and the grain is green. Too late, and the seed scatters. The hand has to learn the season. The eye has to learn the color of ripeness. The body has to learn how much work is hidden inside a handful. This is why bread is never only technology, it is also perception. It begins with noticing. The first steps toward bread are quiet enough that they do not look like invention from far away. There is no single moment where a person stands up and declares that the age of bread has begun. Instead, there are many small gestures repeated until they become knowledge. Collecting, drying, rubbing, winnowing, pounding, wetting, heating. Every culture that made bread had to solve these problems in its own way. How do you separate grain from chaff? How fine does the meal need to be? How much water makes a paste, and how much makes a dough? How hot should the stone be? How close should dough sit to fire? How do you keep it from burning outside while staying raw inside? The answers are practical, but they are also intimate. Bread knowledge is the kind of knowledge carried in hands. It is known by touch before it is written in words. A dough can be too wet, too dry, too tight, too slack, too young, too tired. Bakers still speak this way because dough is not only measured. That gives us a link across time. We cannot know the names of the Natufian people at Shubaika I. We cannot hear the ordinary jokes in an Egyptian bakery. We cannot smell a loaf from Herculaneum before the AD 79 eruption changed it forever. But we do know something of the hand-kneading dough, because that kneading still happens. When a modern baker presses fingertips into dough, folds it, turns it, waits for it, and checks the oven, the gesture is new and old at once. This is one of the gentlest ways history touches the present, not through a monument, but through emotion. Long before bread was a daily food, people were already learning the possibilities of grain. One useful place to begin is Ohalo II, an archaeological site on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. The site is about 23,000 years old. Researchers have found evidence there for the processing of wild cereal grains, including wild wheat, barley, and oats. That distinction matters. What it does show is earlier and quieter. People were paying attention to grasses. They were gathering tiny seeds that could easily have been ignored. They were using tools and surfaces to process plant food. They were bringing together hand, stone, seed, and intention. Imagine the sound of it at night. Not a factory, not a bakery, just a small grinding sound against stone, steady and patient. Seeds crack, husks loosen, dust gathers on fingertips. The work is repetitive, but repetition is often how human life learns. A seed does not offer itself like fruit. Fruit says, "I am ready, take me." Grain asks for more. Grain must be found, collected, separated, ground, soaked, cooked. It resists the hand at first. But once people learned the trick of it, grain became one of the great bridges between human memory and the land. It travels. It can feed a family in a dry season. It can become porridge, cake, beer, or bread. At this early stage, we should picture possibility more than certainty. There may have been roasted grains, gruels, pastes, crushed seeds cooked on hot stones, and many plant foods that left little trace. Archaeology is always partly an art of listening to what survived. Baskets decay. Soft food disappears, but charred fragments, stone tools, and microscopic residues sometimes remain. They are small witnesses, and from them we can begin to see that the story of bread does not start with a polished loaf. It starts with people experimenting at the edge of what a seed could become. We should imagine that experimentation slowly. A person does not need to know the word carbohydrate to feel that grain is sustaining. A person does not need to know the chemistry of starch gelatinization to notice that crushed grain and water change when heated. The body learns before science names the process. Some discoveries may have been deliberate. Others may have arrived as accidents that someone was wise enough to remember. Perhaps a wet grain paste dried near heat and became firm enough to carry. Perhaps crushed seeds cooked against hot stone became easier to chew. Perhaps a thin paste blistered and browned, and someone preferred the taste. Food history is filled with moments like that, not miracles but noticed accidents. The earliest grain foods would not have had the clean categories we use now. Porridge, gruel, cake, paste, flatbread, cracker, dumpling, beer mash. These are names we apply from later kitchens. At the beginning, the boundaries were probably soft. A little more water and the grain becomes porridge. A little less and it becomes dough. A little more heat and it becomes crisp. A little more time and fermentation begins. This is one reason bread is hard for archaeology. It sits between grain and meal, between paste and cake, between plant and craft. A charred fragment might preserve shape, structure, or plant particles. A grinding stone might preserve residues. A hearth might preserve ash. But the original experience of the food, its warmth, smell, and taste, is mostly gone. So the careful historian must resist making the fragment speak too loudly. If the source says grain processing, we say grain processing. If the source says bread-like remains, we say bread-like remains. If the source says possible fermentation, we say possible or reported fermentation. The discipline is part of the beauty. It lets the past remain itself. Instead of forcing ancient people into our modern pantry, we visit them more respectfully. We let their food be unfamiliar where it is unfamiliar. We let the evidence be partial where it is partial. And yet, even with all that caution, the scene remains deeply human. A grinding stone, wild cereals, hands dusty with flour before flour had a settled agricultural world around it. The first chapters of Bread are not about abundance. They are about attention, repetition, and the willingness to work with small things. Now we come to one of the most important dates in the history of bread. At Sourdough I, in northeastern Jordan, archaeologists studied charred food remains from a Natufian hunter-gatherer site. In 2018, researchers published evidence for bread-like products dated to about 14,400 years ago. Using the archaeological convention of before present, where present means 1950, that is roughly around 12,450 BCE. This is earlier than agriculture. That is the startling part. For a long time, it was easy to imagine the sequence in a simple way. First farming, then grain, then bread. But Sourdough I complicates that story. It suggests that people were making bread-like flat products before fully domesticated farming became the center of life. Again, we should be careful with the words. These were not soft sandwich loaves. They were not baguettes. They were not modern sourdough bowls with open crumb and crisp crust. The researchers described bread-like food remains, likely made from wild cereals and other plant ingredients, probably prepared as flat products. But even that careful sentence is beautiful. Bread-like food before agriculture. A flat-cooked food made from gathered plants, water, grinding, skill, and heat. Picture a small Natufian settlement. There are stone structures, hearths, tools, gathered plants, and people whose names are gone but whose work still speaks through the fragments they left behind. To make something bread-like in that world would have required planning. You would need enough grain or plant material. You would need to remove husks, grind or crush the material, mix it with liquid, shape it, and cook it without burning it completely. It is not impossible work, but it is not accidental either. Bread asks the maker to think ahead. That may be one of the reasons it matters. A berry can be eaten now. A piece of meat can be roasted now. But bread begins before hunger reaches its loudest point. Bread begins in collection, storage, grinding, preparation, and heat. It is food with memory built into it. The Sourdough I evidence also raises a wonderful question. Did people begin to cultivate grain partly because foods like bread were already desirable? In other words, maybe bread was not only a result of farming. Maybe the taste, texture, ritual, and usefulness of grain foods helped draw people toward farming. We do not need to turn that into a slogan. It is enough to let the possibility rest there. Long before the bakery window, long before the miller, long before the medieval market and the paper-wrapped loaf, people in northeastern Jordan were already turning wild plant foods into something recognizable enough that modern researchers could call it bread-like. And in that small word, bread-like, the whole later history is waiting. It is worth resting with that a little longer. Bread-like. The word protects us from pretending too much, but it also invites us close. What makes something bread-like? It is not only that it contains grain. A pot of boiled grain is not bread. A handful of raw seeds is not bread. Bread-like food suggests a transformation. Plant material reduced, mixed, shaped, and heated into something with structure. That structure matters. A paste can be eaten with a hand or a spoon, but a flat cake can be carried. It can be broken. It can be shared in pieces. It can be placed beside other food. It can become a surface for dipping, scooping, or absorbing. Once grain becomes bread-like, it becomes more portable, more social, and perhaps more ceremonial. This is why archaeologists and food historians pay attention to tiny fragments. The remains at Shubaika I were charred. They survived because burning, which usually destroys, sometimes preserves. The very thing that ruined the food made it available to the future. That is one of archaeology's strange gifts: the burnt edge, the broken pot, the discarded bone, the lost seed, the accident. From a sleepy distance, we can imagine the scene without claiming to see what cannot be seen. There may have been a hearth. There may have been gathered plants. There may have been people who knew which grasses were useful and which were not. There may have been repeated practice around grinding and cooking. The important point is not to fill every blank with certainty. The important point is to recognize skill. Hunter-gatherer life is sometimes described as though it were simple. But making bread-like food before agriculture is not simple. It requires ecological knowledge. It requires memory of seasons. It requires choosing plants, processing them, and managing fire. It also suggests that taste and texture mattered. People do not usually repeat labor-intensive food practices only because they are possible. They repeat them because the result is worth the effort. Bread, even at its earliest edge, may have been special. Not special in the way of luxury, necessarily. Special in the way of effort. Special in the way of gathering together. Special in the way of a food that asks more from the maker than simply reaching out and taking. There is a philosophical softness in that. The first breads may not have been everyday food. They may have appeared for gatherings, seasonal moments, or particular meals. The evidence does not let us say exactly, but the labor itself suggests that bread-like food had value beyond convenience, and perhaps that is why bread still feels different from many foods. Even now, when flour comes in paper bags and yeast comes in packets, bread carries the memory of effort. A loaf on the counter feels like something made, not only assembled. It has passed through waiting. The earliest bread-like remains therefore do more than push a date backward. They change the emotional shape of the story. They tell us that before fields were fully domesticated, before villages became towns, before written recipes and bakery regulations, people had already begun exploring the deep relationship between grain and fire. They had already begun making something that could be broken and shared. And once a food can be broken and shared, it enters the moral life of a community. After Shubaika I, the story widens. Bread-like food had appeared before farming, but farming changed the scale of what grain could mean. About 10,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, wheat domestication became part of the larger agricultural revolution. A useful USDA summary describes wheat domestication as a key event in that shift from hunter-gatherer lifeways toward farming, especially through early domesticated einkorn and emmer wheat in southeast Turkey. We should keep that date approximate. Agriculture did not begin everywhere on a single morning. It did not arrive like a door opening. It was a long pattern of cultivation, selection, storage, settlement, risk, and reward. Wild grain falls from its stalk when it is ready, because that is how a grass plants itself. Domestic grain slowly became different. People favored plants whose seeds stayed on the stalk long enough to harvest. Year after year, generation after generation, the field changed because human hands kept choosing. The plant and the people altered one another. That is one of the quiet philosophical turns in this story. Human beings domesticated grain. But grain also domesticated human time. It asked people to return to the same ground, to watch rain, to clear fields, to store seed, to plan for next year before this year had ended. A loaf on the table is not only food, it is weather remembered, labor stored, and patience made edible. Once farming expanded, bread could become more regular. Not effortless, never effortless, but regular. The daily work might begin with grain in storage. Grain had to be cleaned. It had to be ground with stone. Flour had to be mixed with water. The dough had to be shaped. A fire had to be managed. because bread depends on heat that is strong but not careless. The early breads of the Near East were often flatbreads or hearth breads. Some could be cooked on hot stones or griddles. Some later traditions used vertical clay ovens, often known by names like tanur or tanuru in ancient Near Eastern contexts, where dough could be placed against hot inner walls. Here again, we should be cautious. We are not saying one oven form explains every ancient kitchen. Bread ovens varied by region, period, household, and fuel. Some were simple, some permanent, some portable, some part of larger workshops. Archaeologists have to interpret ash, clay, stones, residues, and installations that do not always announce their exact use. But the broad point is secure enough. As grain became more dependable, bread became a repeated technology. It belonged to the body because it fed. It belonged to the house because it required routine. It belonged to the village because grinding and baking could be shared labor. And eventually it belonged to states, temples, and cities, because wherever grain can be stored, measured, rationed, and taxed, power is never far away. Bread begins as comfort, but very quickly bread also becomes organization. The granary is one of the hidden ancestors of the bakery. A field gives food only at certain times, but a granary stretches the field into the future. Stored grain makes planning possible. It also makes anxiety possible in a new way. When food is gathered in one place, people have to guard it, count it, keep it dry, protect it from pests, decide who receives it, and remember how much seed must be saved for planting. Bread depends on this quiet arithmetic. How much grain can be eaten now? How much must be kept? How much can be ground today? How much flour should be used for a household, a work crew, a feast, an offering, or a journey? The mathematics of bread begins before writing, but writing later gives it a visible form. Measures, accounts, rations, and receipts all grow naturally around grain, because grain is countable in a way that many foods are not. A fresh fish spoils, a ripe fruit bruises, a live animal must be fed. It is patient food. That patience changed human society. It allowed larger households, larger settlements, and eventually cities to imagine tomorrow in a more material way. A store of grain is a store of time. It is a promise that hunger may be answered later. Of course, the promise could fail. A granary can rot. A field can flood. Irrigation can go wrong. Insects can arrive. War can burn a crop before harvest. A ruler can take too much. A drought can make every saved seed feel like a small and fragile hope. Bread, therefore, carries both comfort and fear. In a good year, it is abundance. In a bad year, it is calculation. For the person grinding grain, the work was physical. Stone grinding is not a gentle metaphor. It is pressure through shoulders, wrists, back, and knees. It is dust in the nose and sound in the room. It is the body becoming part of the mill. This matters because bread can look peaceful only after the labor is complete. A loaf resting under cloth is calm. The work that made it was not effortless. The more we follow bread through history, the more we should keep the workers visible. Gatherers, farmers, reapers, millers, bakers, fuel carriers, water carriers, sellers, servants, household cooks, enslaved laborers, women grinding in domestic spaces, men working ovens in some public bakeries, children sent to fetch loaves, and officials checking measures. Bread is never one person's achievement. Even a solitary baker at home depends on fields, mills, salt, water, fuel, vessels, and inherited knowledge. The loaf is communal before it ever reaches the table. That is why the rise of farming does not make bread less mysterious. It makes the mystery larger. Ancient Egypt gives us some of the most beautiful surviving evidence for bread as daily labor. One of the clearest surviving anchors comes from the tomb of Mechatri at Thebes. The Metropolitan Museum of Art dates its model bakery and brewery to about 1981 to 1975 BC in the Middle Kingdom. The model shows a combined workshop where bread and beer production are closely related. The museum description notes grain crushing, grinding, dough work, possible yeast, water, fermentation, ovens, loaves, and cakes. It is a small wooden world. Workers bend over grain. Millers grind flour. Dough is mixed. Ovens are tended. Conical loaves sit in a basket. Beer is processed nearby. It is not a photograph of one exact day in the Middle Kingdom, but it is a careful ancient representation of work that mattered. Bread and beer belonged together in Egypt, partly because they shared materials and processes. Emmer wheat and barley were important grains. Grinding mattered. Fermentation mattered. Heat mattered. Water mattered. The relationship between bread and beer can feel strange if we imagine modern bread in one aisle and modern beer somewhere else. But for ancient Egypt, they were closer cousins. Grain could move toward dough or toward mash. Fermentation could make bread rise or turn sugars toward drink. Delwyn Samuel's microscopy study of ancient Egyptian bread loaves and beer remains, published in Science in 1996, found that ancient Egyptian bread was not made only with flour from raw grain. Some bread also involved malt and yeast. A University of Cambridge research feature puts an important date on the point. Yeast was used to make bread rise by about 1400 BC. A UCL museum summary, also discussing Samuel's work, calls the evidence for yeast use in bread by about 1400 BC the earliest known example of that use, while also noting that we do not know exactly when or how yeast was first used for bread baking. So we will say it carefully. By about 1400 BC, there is evidence for yeast in Egyptian bread. We will not say that Egypt invented sourdough. We will not say that every Egyptian loaf was leavened. We will not pretend that a modern sourdough starter on a countertop is identical to an ancient Egyptian process. But we can say this: Egypt gives us strong evidence for a world where bread, beer, fermentation, and skilled grain work were deeply connected. The bread itself could take many forms. Some loaves were shaped in molds. Some were conical. Some were probably coarse, some finer. Some may have included ingredients like dates or figs in certain contexts. Bread could be everyday ration, tomb offering, household food, temple supply, an image of abundance. Now imagine an Egyptian bakery at dawn. The air is dry outside, but inside the work is humid and warm. Flour dust clings to skin. Stone tools rasp softly. A worker tends an oven, watching the color of heat. Someone mixes dough in a basin. Someone carries water. Someone shapes loaves with practiced hands. The loaf that emerges is not just food. It is Nile flood, field, sickle, granary, millstone, yeast, smoke, and labor. It is also philosophy, in a form that can be eaten. Bread reminds us that transformation is often ordinary. It does not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes transformation is flour slowly accepting water. Sometimes it is a living fermentation beginning too small to see. Sometimes it is heat turning softness into crust. But they also knew, as all bread-making cultures know, that a loaf is a little cooperation between the human hand and forces the hand does not fully control. Grain grows, but not because we command it. Yeast works, but not because we can see it. Fire bakes, but only if we tend it. Bread is therefore practical and humbling at the same time. Egypt also helps us think about bread as image. Many ancient foods vanished almost completely. They were eaten, spilled, digested, burned, swept away, or left to decay. But Egypt preserved food history in unusual ways. Tomb goods, models, wall scenes, dried remains, and objects placed in relation to the dead. The dead were not imagined as needing nothing. Food offerings, scenes of abundance, models of production, and symbolic supplies all belong to the hope that life, or something like life, continued beyond death. Bread therefore appears not only as daily food, but as a promise of continuity. A loaf offered to the dead says, "May hunger not follow you." That is a powerful human wish. The Mecca model is especially useful because it does not only show finished food, it shows labor in sequence. The workers are not just holding loaves for display, they are engaged in the steps that make bread and beer possible. Crush, grind, mix, ferment, bake, store, carry. This sequence is worth moving through slowly, one action at a time, without inventing false dates. The model itself is dated about 1981 to 1975 BC. The broader processes shown in it are older and longer lived, but the object gives us a firm anchor in time. For a sleepy viewer, a scene like this can be beautiful if handled gently. Imagine an Egyptian bakery room, warm with clay ovens, not too dramatic, not too crowded, with flour dust and soft light, and baskets of conical loaves. The image should remain respectful and historically careful, not a fantasy palace kitchen. The yeast evidence, by about 1400 BC, deserves the same care. Yeast is small, but its historical meaning is large. Before microscopes, people did not see yeast as organisms. They knew results. A dough rose, a mash fermented, a smell changed, a texture opened. The invisible world announced itself through bubbles, foam, sourness, lift, and aroma. That is one of bread's great lessons. Not everything real is visible. An ancient baker did not need the language of microbiology to work skillfully with fermentation. Knowledge can be empirical without being microscopic. It can be built through repetition, failure, observation, and memory. Perhaps a baker noticed that yesterday's dough helped today's dough rise. Perhaps brewing and baking shared materials, vessels, and yeasty residues. Perhaps household practice preserved what theory could not yet explain. We should keep perhaps where perhaps belongs. There is a kind of intelligence that lives in waiting for the right smell. There is intelligence in knowing when dough has changed enough. There is intelligence in the hand that feels a dough's readiness before any clock confirms it. Egyptian bread, in this sense, lets us connect ancient craft with modern sourdough. Not by saying they are the same, but by noticing that both depend on collaboration with living processes. The modern starter jar and the ancient bakery basin are separated by thousands of years. But both belong to the same family of wonder. Flour and water are never only flour and water for long. Egypt also gives us a way to think about scale. Some bread was household bread, some was workshop bread, some belonged to temples, estates, labor systems, and offerings. The same basic food could move through many levels of society. A loaf could be small enough for one hand and important enough to appear in scenes of provision for eternity. We can keep moving between the intimate and the large. The intimate, a worker grinding grain, a hand shaping dough, heat rising from clay, a basket holding finished loaves. The large, fields along the Nile, storage rooms, estate workers, tomb provisions, ritual offerings, beer jars, administration. Bread crosses the boundary between them. That is part of why it appears so often in ancient economies. It can be counted, carried, eaten, offered, owed, and stored for a time. It can be made in repeated forms. It can become part of a ration system because it is practical and familiar. Yet even when bread enters administration, it does not lose its sensory life. This is important. A record can reduce bread to a number, a ration, a list, but the eater still encounters smell, crust, crumb, chew, dryness, sourness, sweetness, coarseness, softness, and fullness. Bread may be counted by institutions, but it is experienced by bodies. That tension runs through almost every bread culture. The state counts loaves, the household eats them. The temple receives them. The worker depends on them. The baker feels them. And the historian, thousands of years later, tries to understand them through models, fragments, texts, and residue. Here we can rest inside slow, repeated labor. We do not have to rush. Grinding grain can take a minute of narration. Mixing dough can take another. The oven can be described as a warm center of the room. The basket of conical loaves can be given a little silence around it. Because sleep history is not only about information. It is about pace. A good slow documentary lets the listener feel that the past is not chasing them. It is simply there, lit by oven glow, covered in flour, working at its own ancient speed. Now let us move into Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, where grain, beer, bread, temples, scribes, and cities all belong to the same complicated world. Mesopotamia does not give us one simple bread recipe that we can lift from a clay tablet and bake exactly in a modern kitchen. That is important. The oldest surviving culinary tablets from the Yale Babylonian collection are extraordinary, but they are not a tidy modern cookbook of loaves. They are old Babylonian culinary texts, often dated broadly around 1900 to 1600 BC. One tablet, known as YBC 4644, in the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, contains recipes largely for stews or broths. In at least one context, prepared dried barley cakes or bread-like grain cakes appear as ingredients rather than as the main recipe itself. So the honest phrasing is this: Mesopotamian written food culture shows that grain preparations, cakes, breads, and beer-like ingredients were part of a sophisticated cuisine. It does not mean we have permission to pretend that a modern loaf is an exact old Babylonian bread. The tablets are still wonderful. Imagine a scribe pressing signs into damp clay. The marks are small, but the world behind them is large. Kitchens, storerooms, barley, onions, fat, herbs, vessels, heat, service, and memory. Food becomes administration. Taste becomes text. In southern Mesopotamia, barley was especially important. Wheat existed, but barley tolerated salinity better, and irrigation agriculture could slowly bring salt into the soil. Bread and beer were therefore not only matters of flavor, they were tied to rivers, canals, floodplains, labor crews, and the long struggle of farming in a hot alluvial land. It is easy to romanticize ancient bread as rustic and simple. But in a city like Babylon, or in older cities like Uruk and Ur, bread would have belonged to a world of measures and payments. Grain could pay workers, rations could be recorded, temples and palaces could organize production. Bread could be sacred, economic, and ordinary all at once. That is one of bread's great powers. It can sit in the hand of a laborer, it can be offered to a god, it can be written into an account. It can be dipped into a stew, shared beside beer, carried across a courtyard, or counted in a storehouse. And even when the exact recipe is lost, the pattern remains visible. Grain transformed by human care into a daily form of life. The connection between bread and beer is especially important in Mesopotamia. Both begin with grain, both depend on water. Both can be humble household substances and also part of temple, palace, and labor systems. In a world where barley mattered deeply, the border between eating grain and drinking grain was not as sharp as modern supermarket categories suggest. Grain could be ground, baked, soaked, fermented, strained, or cooked into different forms. Some of those forms were solid, some liquid, and some somewhere in between. This is a good place to remember that ancient food words do not always match modern ones. When a translation says cake, we should not instantly picture birthday cake. When it says bread, we should not instantly picture a sandwich loaf. When it says beer, we should not instantly picture a clear modern lager in a glass bottle. Ancient categories belong to ancient foodways. Let those ancient categories feel different. The Yale-Harvard team that tested Babylonian recipes did something valuable, because they approached the tablets as evidence, not as novelty. They had to ask what ingredients meant, what cooking verbs implied, what vessels might have been used, and how much modern reconstruction was necessary. That kind of experimental work is useful, but it also shows how many decisions stand between a cuneiform text and a modern plate. So when we bring cuneiform tablets into a sleep documentary about bread, we should let them be what they are, evidence of a literate food culture, not a shortcut to certainty. The tablets can still create a beautiful scene. Think of clay in the hand, a reed stylus, signs pressed one after another. Not ink flowing across paper, but small wedges entering earth. Writing itself becomes a kind of baking. Wet clay receives an impression, then dries into permanence. Food that was eaten and forgotten has left, beside it, a hardened record of how people thought about preparation. There's another quiet parallel. Bread and writing both depend on surfaces. Dough receives the marks of fingers, cuts, stamps, and molds. Clay receives the marks of a stylus. Both are soft first. Both become firm later. Both can preserve intention. Mesopotamia was also a landscape where water had to be managed. Rivers gave life, but not politely. Irrigation could make fields productive, but canals demanded labor. Floods could help or destroy. In some areas, salts could accumulate in irrigated soils over long periods, affecting crops and encouraging the importance of barley in places where it tolerated conditions better than wheat. That gives bread a landscape. The loaf does not begin at the oven. It begins in river management. It begins in mud, canal banks, dates, reeds, grain fields, workers, animals, and overseers. If the modern listener feels sleepy by now, that's all right. Bread history rewards a drifting kind of attention. You can let the details settle like flour dust. Tigris, Euphrates, barley, clay, tablet, oven, bowl, stew, beer, bread like cakes. The words themselves become a slow procession, and at the center is the same transformation, the earth's grain brought indoors, worked by hands, and made into sustenance. By the time we reach the Greek and Roman Mediterranean, bread has become an urban food as well as a household food. It still begins with grain, water, heat, and hands, but now we can also see it in streets, shops, ovens, and bakeries. Bread is moving through cities. It is bought and sold. It is part of public life. In Rome's world, bread could be made at home, but professional baking also grew in importance. Herculaneum's archaeological park describes evidence for bread as a cornerstone of food culture there, with carbonized round loaves marked by radial cuts and sometimes by stamps. The same material world includes raw ingredients, milling tools, and baking tools. The most haunting date is AD 79. In that year, Mount Vesuvius erupted. Pompeii and Herculaneum were overwhelmed. The disaster preserved in terrible form an ordinary Roman food world that would otherwise have vanished. The Ashmolean Museum's Last Supper in Pompeii exhibition included carbonized bread from Pompeii, dated to AD 79, among many food objects connected with the eruption. There is something almost impossible about seeing bread from AD 79. Bread is supposed to disappear. It is meant to be eaten, torn, dipped, shared, fed to a child, carried by a worker, placed on a table, or swept away as crumbs. Bread is perishable by design. Its whole purpose is to vanish into life. But volcanic heat changed that. The loaves became black, silent, and enduring. They crossed nearly 2,000 years not because anyone meant to preserve them, but because catastrophe interrupted lunch, work, trade, and baking all at once. Herculaneum also gives us a glimpse of bakery equipment. The archaeological park describes the bakery of Sextus Petulcius Felix as a place where the production cycle could run from grinding wheat to kneading flour, baking, and selling. Bronze pans found there in 1936 were used for flatbreads and pastries. Again, We should be careful. This does not hand us one universal Roman bread recipe. Roman bread varied by grain, household, city, wealth, and region. Wheat mattered, but other grains and legumes could appear in broader food culture. Some loaves were coarse, some were finer, some were bought from bakers, some were probably made in smaller domestic settings. But the Roman evidence lets us hold bread in a very specific year, AD 79, not ancient times in a vague mist. AD 79, when people in Pompeii and Herculaneum were producing, buying, selling, and eating food beneath a mountain they did not know was about to become the keeper of their tables. That is one reason bread is such a powerful historical object. A sword tells us about power, a coin tells us about trade, a temple tells us about worship. But a loaf tells us someone expected another ordinary meal. It tells us about hunger without drama. It tells us about habit. It tells us that history is not only battles and kings. History is also a baker measuring flour before sunrise, a customer waiting in a street, a child tearing a piece from the edge of a loaf, and heat working quietly inside an oven. Roman bread also asks us to think about public dependence. In a small household, bread can be private. A family grows or buys grain, grinds it, bakes it, and eats it. But in a large city, bread becomes an urban system. The city must be fed every day. Grain must move across distance. Mills must work. Bakers must keep producing. Markets must function. Roads, ships, storehouses, and money all become part of the loaf. That makes urban bread vulnerable. If supply breaks, hunger does not wait politely. If prices rise, the poor feel it first. If a bakery burns, if a ship is delayed, if a harvest is poor, the city's stomach tightens. So the Roman loaf is not only charming because it is old, it is revealing because it shows how many invisible systems are required for ordinary life to feel ordinary. The carbonized loaves from Vesuvius are often photographed as single objects, sitting alone in a taste. That is understandable. The dark, round shape, the cuts, the impossible survival of bread across centuries, all of that catches the eye. It belonged to the morning's need. The eruption of AD 79 preserved the thing, but the thing points back to the system. This is the value of object history. A single loaf can open a city. Look closely enough, and the bread leads outward, to the mill, to the baker, to the grain ship, to the farm, to the road, to the money in a hand, to the table where someone expected to eat. Imagine this Roman world quietly, not like a gladiator film. A bakery interior, stone mills, flour dust in angled light, round loaves marked before baking, a counter where bread is sold, perhaps a distant suggestion of Vesuvius, only when the AD 79 moment arrives. No sensational smoke at the beginning. Let the ordinary come first. That will make the date more powerful. AD 79 matters because the day began as an ordinary day. History often becomes tragic by interrupting routine. And bread is one of the purest signs of routine. When we move into medieval Europe, bread remains central, but it becomes impossible to describe it as one thing. There is no single medieval bread. There are breads of wheat, rye, barley, oats, and mixtures. There are breads shaped by soil, climate, harvest, poverty, fasting, trade, household skill, oven access, lordship, church calendars, town rules, and the price of grain. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, writing about medieval cereal grains in the Bonifant Garden at the cloisters, describes wheat, barley, rye, and oats as fundamental to survival for many people in the Middle Ages. Baked into bread, grain was a staple. Malted, it became the basis of ale. As thatch and fodder, it supported shelter and livestock. This is a good place to slow down. Bread was food, but grain was more than food. It roofed houses, it fed animals, it made drink. It became rent, tithe, tax, wage, seed, and storage. The field behind the loaf was therefore never just background. Every slice carried weather, a wet summer, a cold spring, A failed harvest, a war, a bad road, or a greedy measure could all arrive at the table as smaller bread, darker bread, dearer bread, or no bread at all. The Met's discussion of rye notes that, in medieval status language, lighter and fresher wheat bread could signal higher standing, while rye was humbler, even though it became an important staple in temperate Europe. The same source describes rye as well established by the 9th century, and valuable because it could thrive in poor soils and withstand harsh conditions. That gives us a strong image. Wheat is prestige. Rye is survival. Of course, real life was messier. A wealthy household might eat more than bread. A poor household might depend on bread and pottage. A region might rely on rye because the climate suited rye better than wheat. A bad year could blur social lines. A household could bake with what the field allowed, not what pride preferred. In England, the assize of bread and ale is conventionally dated to 1266, in the reign of Henry III. It regulated bread and ale by price, grain cost, and measures. We should not turn that into a statement about all medieval bread everywhere. It is an English example, but it shows something important. Bread was too essential to leave entirely unmeasured. When a food is central to survival, its weight and price become public concerns. If the baker cheats, the household suffers. If grain prices rise, the loaf changes. If measures are unfair, hunger becomes a legal matter. So bread sat at the meeting point of stomach and law. Imagine a medieval town. The street is damp, smoke hangs low. Somewhere bells are marking time. A baker's oven has been heated, and loaves are going in. People know the smell. They also know the price. A loaf is not an abstract comfort. It is dinner, it is breakfast, it is work fuel. It is something to stretch with broth, cheese, onions, beans, or ale. Some breads may have been fine and pale. Some were dark and dense. Some were mixed grain. Some were stale before they were finished. Some appeared beside stews, broths, and sauces in dining contexts that varied by household, region, and status. Elite tables and household tables did not always share the same habits. But every form returns us to the same point. Bread is a food that makes inequality visible. Not by speech, but by color, texture, weight, and smell. The fine white loaf and the coarse rye loaf both come from the earth, but they do not tell the same social story, and yet both are bread. That is part of the philosophical tension. Bread is shared across class, but not equally. It can be the symbol of common humanity and the evidence of division at the same time. To hold a medieval loaf in the imagination is to hold soil, labor, law, status, and hunger together. It is to remember that the simplest foods often carry the heaviest histories. Medieval bread also had a relationship with ovens that could be social and economic. In many places, not every household had the same access to baking equipment. Some people baked at home, some used communal ovens, some owed fees, and some lived within systems of lordly or urban control. The details varied widely, and we should not compress them into one rule for every village or town. But the general image is useful. An oven could be a gathering point. It was heat made communal. A large oven took fuel, skill, time, and maintenance. If several households brought dough to be baked, the oven became a place where domestic labor entered public space. Loaves had to be marked or known. Timing mattered. The order of baking mattered. Heat changed as the oven cooled, so different foods might go in at different stages. Bread therefore carried identity. A loaf might show by shape, mark, size, or placement whose dough it was. A baker or household had to recognize it after baking. In a world before uniform packaging, bread still needed forms of memory. This is a lovely detail for a sleepy narration because it makes the loaf personal. It is not merely bread, it is someone's bread. Someone mixed it, someone carried it, someone expected to bring it home. Medieval bread also makes us think about texture. Modern bread culture often prizes softness, but older breads could be coarse, heavy, dark, sour, chewy, stale, or crusty in ways that depended on flour quality, bolting, grain type, hydration, and oven heat. Some loaves would have held bran, some would have been stretched with legumes or other grain in hard years. Some may have been used in soups or soaked foods because hard bread can become tender again when given liquid. This is important for the sleep mood too. We can let the listener imagine textures slowly. The pale cut face of a fine wheat loaf, the darker crumb of rye, the mixed speckle of mixed grain bread, the dry edge of yesterday's bread, the softening of bread in broth, the sound of a crust cracking under a thumb. None of that requires overclaiming. It simply lets the material world breathe. The regulation side, anchored for us by the English assize of bread and ale in 1266, gives another layer. The law did not regulate bread because bread was trivial. It regulated bread because ordinary people could not simply opt out of needing it. Bread's weight mattered, its price mattered, its grain mattered. A small deception repeated across many loaves could become a large theft from the hungry. That is why bread appears again and again in histories of markets, towns, and unrest. People may tolerate many abstractions from a distance, but a shrinking loaf is not abstract. A hungry household understands immediately. Bread is one of the places where economics becomes bodily. This medieval world should feel both cozy and honest. There can be warm ovens, village streets, flour sacks, and candlelit tables. But there should also be a quiet awareness that for many people bread was not an aesthetic object. It was survival measured by the day. The sleepy tone does not require us to sand away hardship. It requires us to speak of hardship gently and truthfully. Medieval bread can also help us talk about sound. A mill turning, a sack set down, grain poured into a bin, dough slapped lightly against a board, an oven door opened, wood shifting in coals, bread cooling on a table, coins counted in a market. These are not grand historical sounds, but they are the sounds by which daily life stays alive. For many medieval households, bread was not eaten alone as an elegant object. It belonged with pottage, broth, ale, cheese, onions, herbs, beans, fish when available, meat on better days, and whatever local custom and income allowed. Harder bread could be softened. Stale bread could be used rather than wasted. Crumbs mattered. Waste itself is a historical clue. A poor table must often transform leftovers into another meal. Bread appears in that second life too, soaked, toasted, thickening, crumbled, used beneath food, or carried for later. The loaf is not one moment. It has a life cycle: fresh, warm, cut, torn. Stale, soaked, crumbed, gone. In medieval kitchens, freshness and status often touched. Fine, fresh white bread could signal privilege. Darker or coarser bread could signal humbler conditions. But there is also resilience in those darker grains. Rye's ability to grow in poorer soils or colder conditions made it vital in parts of Europe. Survival is not always glamorous, but it is deeply intelligent. This is a good place for gentle balance. We do not mock coarse bread. We do not romanticize hunger. We do not treat white bread as morally superior or dark bread as morally pure. We simply notice what different breads meant in different contexts. Bread carries social meaning because people eat it every day. The more often a thing appears, the more meaning gathers around it. A rare jewel may show status once. Daily bread shows status every morning. The medieval law code, the village oven, the rye field, the fine wheat loaf, the mixed grain loaf, and the market scale all belong in the same slow picture. Together they show that bread is not merely food history. It is the history of how ordinary need becomes a social structure. For most of bread's history, flour was slow. Grain had to be crushed, pounded, or ground. The work could be done by hand, by animal power, by water, by wind, and later by steam and electricity. Every change in milling changed bread because flour is not just ground grain. Flour is texture, color, shelf life, status, nutrition, and habit. One of the great modern shifts was roller milling. By the late 19th century, roller milling and gradual reduction milling were transforming flour production. Minnesota Historical Society material on Minneapolis flour milling describes millers in the 1870s perfecting new milling processes, and notes that the rebuilt Washburn-A mill was among the world's most technologically advanced mills when it reopened in 1880. A General Mills history article also describes the rebuilt Washburn-A mill as operating with state-of-the-art steel rollers by mid-1880. White flour had carried status for a very long time. It looked refined. It was soft. It made pale loaves that many people associated with prosperity. But industrial white flour also changed what was removed from grain. Bran and germ could be separated more effectively, and shelf life improved, but the nutritional profile changed too. In the United States, bread and flour enrichment became a major public health and regulatory subject in the 1940s. The FDA's history of bread standards notes wartime enrichment orders and later standards for enriched and non-enriched products. This part of the story should be told calmly. Industrial bread was not simply a villain. It fed cities. It made bread predictable. It made bread cheaper for many families. It fit the schedules of industrial life. It traveled, stacked, sliced, and kept. It also distanced many people from flour fermentation and the older sensory knowledge of dough. Modernity often does both things at once. It solves a problem and creates a longing. Commercial yeast is part of that change. Yeast itself, of course, is ancient in food practice. People used fermentation long before they could see or name yeast cells. But specialized commercial baker's yeast belongs to a much later story. The National Park Service notes that commercial manufacture of a special yeast for bakers did not begin until 1870. Fleischmann's company history places the Fleischmann brothers' compressed yeast work in Cincinnati in 1868, an important American commercial milestone. This gave bakers consistency. A starter culture can be moody. It changes with flour, temperature, time, feeding, and local microbes. Commercial yeast is designed to be reliable. It rises when expected. It fits production schedules. It makes bread easier to standardize. Then came slicing. The Smithsonian's National Museum of American History identifies Otto Frederick Roederer's first effective bread slicing machine as being put into service in 1928 by the Chillicothe Bacon Company in Missouri. A Smithsonian object record also notes that a 1928 commercial bread slicing machine was manufactured for Roederer's company and used at Korn's Bakery in Davenport later that year. By 1930, sliced bread was spreading commercially under brands such as Wonder Bread. This may sound like a small convenience, but sliced bread changed the rhythm of eating. A loaf became uniform. Toast became easier. Sandwiches became faster. A parent could make lunch with less mess. A store could sell the promise of cleanliness, speed, and modern domestic order. The phrase, "the best thing since sliced bread," survives because sliced bread felt, for many people, like the perfect little invention. Not grand, not cosmic, but immediately useful every morning. In Britain, another industrial turn came with the Chorleywood bread process. Sources differ slightly on whether to anchor it to 1961 or 1962, so the safest phrasing is the early 1960s. The process used high-speed mechanical dough development to reduce the need for long fermentation and speed up large-scale bread production. A slow dough asks for time, Chorleywood asks for energy. The older baker leans on fermentation. The modern industrial mixer leans on mechanical work. Again, the point is not to panic. It is to notice the trade. Bread becomes faster, softer, and more uniform. It also becomes less attached to the long waiting that gave earlier bread some of its flavor, mystery, and domestic intimacy. This is why, in recent decades, so many people have returned to sourdough, stone-ground flour, local bakeries, and slow fermentation. It is not only about taste, it is about recovering a relationship with time. The kitchen counter becomes a small rebellion against hurry. And the sourdough starter, quietly bubbling in a jar, becomes a reminder that not all useful things should move at industrial speed. The industrial story is especially useful because it brings the listener close to foods they may know personally. Many people listening tonight have eaten sliced bread from a plastic bag. They may remember twist ties, toaster slots, school lunches, soft sandwich slices, peanut butter, grilled cheese, toast with butter, or the square white loaf that seems to belong to childhood as much as to the grocery store. That bread is not outside history. It is history made soft and convenient. It belongs to machines, packaging, railroads, roads, advertising, nutrition policy, factory schedules, and modern household time. If the ancient loaf asks us to imagine grain and fire, the modern sandwich loaf asks us to imagine standardization. Every slice nearly the same, every bag nearly the same, every loaf predictable enough that breakfast can happen while someone is half awake. There is tenderness in that convenience. A parent rushing before school may not want a philosophical loaf. They may want 2 slices that fit the lunchbox. A worker making toast before dawn may not need stone-ground romance. They may need food that is already there. So we should avoid making the modern loaf merely a symbol of decline. It is also a symbol of care under time pressure. Industrial food often emerges because modern life asks ordinary people to move quickly. It solves real problems even when it creates new ones. The return to sourdough, then, is not a rejection of every modern convenience. It is more like a search for balance. People who bake slowly are often not trying to live in the past. They are trying to bring one slower practice into a fast life. The 1928 sliced bread story works beautifully here. It is specific, it is memorable, and it gives us a date that a listener can hold. 1928. An effective bread slicing machine enters service in Chillicothe, Missouri. 1930. Sliced bread spreads commercially through brands such as Wonder Bread. The loaf becomes not only baked, but engineered for repeated identical use. After that, the toaster, the sandwich, the lunchbox, the grocery shelf, and the advertisement all gather around the slice. There is almost a philosophy of the slice. A loaf is a whole, a slice is a unit. A loaf invites tearing or cutting. A slice arrives pre-divided. Modern life loves units because units can be counted, packaged, timed, priced, and repeated. Bread, once again, shows us how society thinks. The Chorleywood bread process adds another layer, not just slicing the loaf but changing time inside the dough itself. Long fermentation is replaced or reduced by high-speed mechanical development. Time gives way to energy. That phrase is worth keeping. Time gives way to energy. It is true in bread and in much of modern life. The machine does quickly what waiting once did slowly, but the result is not identical. It may be useful, efficient, and affordable. It may also leave people longing for flavor, irregularity, crust, and the feeling that something was allowed to become itself. That longing is part of our episode's emotional arc. We travel from hand to machine, and then from machine back to hand. Not because the past was pure, not because the present is empty, but because bread reminds us that humans need both efficiency and ritual. We need to be fed quickly sometimes. We also need sometimes to wait. The industrial story should also include the feeling of flour itself changing. Older stone-ground flour often carried more of the whole grain, unless it was carefully sifted or bolted. Roller milling made separation more efficient. The whiter flour that resulted could be stored and transported more predictably, and it could produce lighter breads that people prized. But it also helped create the later need for enrichment, when parts of the grain containing important nutrients were removed. This is not a simple story of good and bad. It is a story of trade-offs: shelf life for flavor, whiteness for wholeness, speed for fermentation, uniformity for local variation, convenience for touch. Once bread entered modern factories, human hands did not vanish entirely, but they became less visible. Machines mixed, divided, proofed, baked, sliced, wrapped, and moved loaves along. The bakery became a system of timing and throughput. This kind of bread has its own beauty if we look at it honestly. A factory line can be mesmerizing. Dough moving in batches, loaves entering pans, rows passing through heat, steam rising, slicing blades working with fast precision. Bags sealing, trucks leaving before dawn. The scale is astonishing, but it is a different kind of beauty from a hand-shaped sourdough loaf. It is the beauty of coordination rather than intimacy. The modern supermarket loaf is one of the clearest signs that bread became part of a larger promise. Food available every day in predictable form, without each household needing to mill, mix, ferment, bake, and manage fire. That promise is easy to take for granted until it breaks. During shortages, storms, emergencies, or uncertain times, bread shelves can empty quickly. People still reach for bread because it is simple, familiar, and useful. Even modern people with many food choices understand instinctively that bread belongs to security. So the industrial loaf, like the ancient loaf, is still emotional. It may be wrapped in plastic, it may be square and soft, it may be far from a clay oven, but it's still part of the old human desire to know that tomorrow morning has food in it. Now let us spend a little time with sourdough. This part is practical, but it's not a claim that we are recreating an ancient starter. People have relied on sourdough starter microbial communities to make leavened bread for thousands of years, and modern microbiology helps explain what is happening inside the jar. A 2021 eLife study describes sourdough starters as microbial communities containing yeasts and bacteria, and studied 500 starters from 4 continents. A sourdough starter in its simplest home form begins with flour and water. That is almost comically humble. No machine, no packet. No drama, just flour and water, stirred into a paste and fed over days. Wild yeasts and bacteria from the flour and environment begin to grow. The culture becomes acidic. Bubbles appear, aromas develop. The starter becomes a living leavening, something that can help dough rise while also changing flavor, texture, and keeping qualities. Colorado State University Extension describes maintaining a sourdough starter as managing an ecosystem of microscopic yeast and bacteria. It also gives very useful home safety boundaries. Flour is a raw agricultural product and should not be tasted raw. Starter should be judged by appearance, smell, texture, expansion, and records of feeding, not by tasting it before baking. A healthy starter should be fed fresh flour and water regularly. Mold means the starter should be discarded. Refrigeration can slow the need for feeding, and a starter can also be dried for long-term storage. So, in calm modern terms, here is what a starter asks of its keeper. It asks for food, fresh flour and water. It asks for a clean container. It asks for a loose covering while active because it gives off gas. It asks for time at a comfortable room temperature when you want it to grow quickly. It asks for refrigeration if you want to slow it down. It asks for attention to signs of life, bubbles, expansion, a tangy smell, and a batter-like consistency. And it asks for honesty. If there is colored or fuzzy mold, you do not rescue it for romance. You discard it and start over. The poetry of sourdough is real, but food safety is real too. Once established, a starter can be kept for years if it is maintained. Some starters become family objects. They are shared, named, dried, mailed, revived, and carried from kitchen to kitchen. The culture changes over time because living communities are never frozen completely in the past. This is a beautiful point. A sourdough starter is continuity without stillness. It is not the same thing forever. It is kept alive by being changed. Every feeding removes some old starter and adds new flour and water. The keeper preserves the culture by renewing it. Too much nostalgia would kill it. Too much neglect would kill it. The starter survives through a balance of memory and replacement. That is why sourdough belongs so naturally in a philosophical history of bread. It teaches that tradition is not a museum case. Tradition is a living practice. It has to be fed. It has to breathe. It has to be watched, refreshed, and sometimes restarted. If bread is grain transformed by heat, sourdough is grain transformed by time, and time, as always, leaves flavor behind. For a listener who wants to keep a starter, the rhythm is simple in outline, even if the details can take practice. A starter is not a pet exactly, but it does need care. You feed it flour and water. You remove some old starter, so the culture does not simply become an ever-growing jar of hunger and waste. You keep it covered, but not sealed tight while it is active. You watch it rise and fall. You learn what it smells like when it is healthy. CSU Extension's guidance gives us a useful modern rhythm for an established refrigerated starter. Remove it from the refrigerator. Let it warm for an hour or two. Stir it. Remove all but a portion. Feed that portion with water and flour. Let it rise, and then store it again once it has peaked and begun to settle. The exact timing depends on temperature and conditions. That rising and falling is important. A starter does not simply rise forever. It expands as microbes feed and produce gas. Then, when food becomes limited and structure weakens, it settles back. The baker learns to read that arc. Young, hungry, active, peaked, falling. Ready for feeding again. This is why old starters can feel like household clocks. They mark time in bubbles and smell. A cold kitchen slows them. A warm room hurries them. Whole grain flour may change their activity. Hydration changes texture. Neglect changes aroma. The idea of aging a starter is lovely, but it needs the right explanation. A starter can be maintained for a long time, even for many years, if it is fed and protected from contamination. It can also be dried for long-term storage, according to CSU Extension. But an old starter is not magic, because every microbe from the first day is still unchanged. It is a continuing culture, renewed over time through feeding. That is more interesting than magic. It means age is not frozen. Age is continuity through maintenance. A sourdough starter becomes old by surviving many acts of renewal. A glass jar on a counter, a rubber band marking the starting level, small bubbles appearing along the side, a faint smell, flour, yogurt, fruit, vinegar, grain, depending on the culture and moment, a spoon scraping down the jar, a lid resting loosely, the quiet hope that tomorrow's dough will rise. There is also generosity in starter keeping. Because it must be reduced when fed, starter naturally invites sharing. The removed portion can be used in baking, composted, discarded, frozen, or shared. A culture can travel from one kitchen to another. Someone can give a jar to a neighbor or a child who has moved away. A starter can become a small inheritance. It is a beautiful scene to imagine. Not a laboratory, not a shiny influencer kitchen. A warm, quiet countertop. A jar in soft light. Flour on wood. A hand folding dough. The slow swelling of a loaf beneath cloth. The point is not that everyone must bake sourdough. The point is that sourdough lets us see what bread always was, a relationship between human intention and living process. It is also worth saying that sourdough is slow, but not passive. The baker is not doing nothing. The baker is creating conditions. That is a different kind of work. A person who keeps a starter is managing temperature, food, hydration, cleanliness, timing, and observation. They may not be meeting every minute, but they are holding a relationship steady. They are learning the difference between neglect and patience. Patience says, I am giving you the time you need. Bread understands the difference. A dough left too long can over-ferment. A starter unfed too long can weaken. A loaf cut too soon can seem gummy, because the crumb has not finished setting. Waiting is powerful, but waiting still needs wisdom. That is why bread is a gentle correction to modern ideas of productivity. Sometimes care is active motion. Sometimes care is restraint. Sometimes the right action is to fold the dough. Sometimes the right action is to cover it and leave it alone. This is useful for the sleep mood too. The listener does not have to solve the whole story. The listener can let the work continue quietly in the background, the way a starter continues in the jar, or dough rests beneath cloth. The mind, like dough, does not always improve by being handled constantly. Sometimes it needs a covered bowl, a dim room, a little warmth, and time. Now, after all that history, let us come back to the kitchen. This part should feel practical, but we need one clear sentence at the door. These are not exact ancient recipes. They are modern, home-safe breads that help us feel some of the older techniques. They are inspired by the long history we have been discussing. Wild grains, flatbreads, hearth breads, oil-rich breads, coarse grains, and slow fermentation. But unless a source gives us a precise dated recipe, we will not pretend to own one. We will also keep safety simple. Raw dough and raw starters should not be tasted. The FDA warns that raw flour can carry harmful bacteria, and Colorado State University Extension gives the same caution for sourdough starter. So in these recipes, the tasting comes after baking, when heat has done its work. The measurements here are modern and meant for home kitchens. If you like precision, think of them through baker's percentages. In baker's math, the flour is 100%, and everything else is measured against that flour weight. Hydration is the water divided by the flour. That is a modern professional way to describe bread clearly without pretending it is ancient. The first bread is a simple no-knead country loaf. It is familiar, but it teaches patience. Use 500 grams of bread flour or all-purpose flour, 375 grams of water, 10 grams of salt, and a small amount of instant yeast, about 1 gram if you want a long overnight rise. Stir it into a rough dough. Cover it. Let time do the kneading that your hands are not doing. After many hours, the dough will be bubbly, loose, and alive with fermentation. Then shape it gently, let it rest, and bake it in a hot covered pot or on a hot tray with steam until the crust is deep and the inside reaches a safe bake temperature. Colorado State's sourdough bread guidance uses an internal bread temperature of about 190 degrees Fahrenheit for doneness, which is a useful modern benchmark. This bread is not ancient, but it teaches an ancient lesson. Grain rewards waiting. The no-knead loaf is a good first recipe because it is almost a meditation disguised as convenience. You stir it roughly. You leave it alone, and while you are not working, the dough is becoming more workable. That is one of bread's kind surprises. Not all improvement comes from more effort. Some improvement comes from giving flour enough time to absorb water, giving gluten enough time to organize, and giving fermentation enough time to loosen and flavor the dough. The surface may look shaggy at first. It may seem unimpressive. But after a long rest, bubbles appear, the dough stretches, and the smell changes. The baker learns not to judge too early. This is a useful life lesson, but it is also just good bread practice. If a listener makes this loaf, they should remember that flour types vary. A dough made with whole wheat will often want more water than one made mostly with white flour. A warm kitchen will speed fermentation. Bread is alive with conditions, which is why recipes are maps, not cages. When it bakes, the covered pot or steam helps the crust expand before it sets. Then, the loaf colors, the crust firms, and the smell fills the kitchen with that familiar promise. Something simple has become enough. This is the bread for understanding time. The second bread is a soft flatbread. This one echoes some of the oldest bread forms without claiming to reproduce them. Flatbreads are historically widespread because they are fast, flexible, and do not require a tall loaf structure. Use 400 grams of flour, 240 grams of water, 8 grams of salt, and 15 grams of olive oil or another mild oil. You may add a small amount of yeast if you want it softer and puffier, or leave it unleavened for a simpler version. Mix, knead briefly, rest the dough, divide it into small balls, roll them flat, and cook them on a hot pan until they blister and brown. This bread is a good bridge to the past because it does not ask for much equipment. A surface, heat, hands, a few ingredients. Flatbread is a good reminder that bread does not have to be tall to be complete. A modern baking culture shaped by pan loaves and tall sourdough boules can make flatbread feel like a lesser form, but historically that would be a mistake. Flatbreads are brilliant. They are quick, useful, adaptable, and deeply human. They can wrap food, they can scoop food, they can be torn and shared. They can be eaten fresh from heat, still soft and steaming. They can be made in places where fuel is precious and long baking is impractical. A flatbread also invites touch. Rolling, patting, turning, watching bubbles rise in a hot pan, pressing down a stubborn edge with a cloth or spatula. The whole process is immediate. There is no long drama of oven spring. There is heat, attention, and a moment when the dough puffs like it is taking one sudden breath. If using yeast, the flatbread becomes softer and more pillowy. If leaving it unleavened, it becomes simpler, closer to flour and water transformed by direct heat. Neither version should be called prehistoric, but both can help the modern listener feel why flat-cooked grain foods have been so durable across human food history. This is the bread for understanding usefulness. The third bread is an olive oil hearth-style bread. Here we move toward the Mediterranean imagination: oil, salt, herbs, and a dough soft enough to dimple with fingertips. Use 500 grams of flour, 400 grams of water, 10 grams of salt, 5 grams of yeast, and 40 grams of olive oil. Mix it into a wet dough, let it rise, fold it a few times if you like, spread it into an oiled pan, let it rise again, press your fingers gently into the surface, drizzle with a little more oil, and bake until golden. Again, this is modern, but it lets the listener feel how bread can become landscape. Oil from groves, grain from fields, salt from sea or mine, herbs from dry hillsides, heat from a household oven. An olive oil bread also lets us talk about enrichment without going all the way into cake. Plain bread can be only flour, water, salt, and leavening, but humans rarely leave good things alone. They add oil, herbs, fruit, nuts, seeds, cheese, honey, milk, eggs, spices, or whatever the landscape and household can afford. Somewhere along that long road, bread begins to lean toward festival bread, sweet bread, pastry, and cake. That is the doorway to another long story. For now, focaccia-style bread is enough. It shows how a dough can become a field of flavor. Oil changes the crumb and crust. Salt sparkles on top. Herbs give fragrance. Finger dimples catch little pools of oil and make the surface uneven in a beautiful way. This bread should not be rushed after it is spread in the pan. Letting it rest again gives it softness. The fingertips should press gently, not angrily. The dough should look dimpled, not punished. There is a tenderness to that gesture. You press the dough and it rises back in its own way. When it bakes, the edge is crisp and the interior stays soft. It is bread as generosity, bread meant to be cut into squares, brought to a table, shared with soup, olives, cheese, or simply eaten warm while standing in the kitchen. This is the bread for understanding abundance. The fourth bread is an Natufian-inspired wild grain flatbread. This one needs the strongest caution. It is not a Shubaika 1 recipe. We do not have a little card from about 12,450 BCE telling us measurements, timing, or taste. What we have is archaeological evidence for bread-like products made before agriculture, likely from wild cereals and other plant ingredients. So, the modern version should be presented as an imagination exercise built around older techniques. Use a mix of whole grain flours, perhaps 150 grams whole wheat flour, 100 grams barley flour, and 50 grams rye or spelt flour. Add enough water to form a soft paste or dough, maybe 180 to 220 grams, depending on the flour. Add a small pinch of salt if desired, knowing that salt may not belong in every prehistoric reconstruction. Let it rest so the grains hydrate. Pat it into thin rounds and cook on a hot stone, griddle, or pan until the surface browns and the inside is cooked through. The point is not perfection. The point is texture. Coarser grain, less loft, more earth. This bread reminds us that early bread was probably closer to a cooked grain cake or flat product than to the soft loaf in a grocery bag. If a listener makes a version like this, they may notice that it resists modern expectations. It may not puff dramatically. It may not slice cleanly. It may not look like the bread they are used to seeing in a bakery window. That is all right. The point is not to impress the modern eye. The point is to feel just a little how much work can live inside a plain grain cake. Whole grain flours can taste nutty, bitter, sweet, grassy, or earthy, depending on the grain and freshness. Barley can make a dough more fragile. Rye can bring stickiness. Spelt can feel softer. Coarse meal changes the chew. A little rest lets the grain hydrate, which can make the final bread less harsh. This bread may be best eaten with something wet or rich. Soup, stew, yogurt, olive oil, beans, or honey, if the listener is not trying to stay close to the older inspiration. And there is a nice philosophical lesson in its plainness. Modern food often hides labor behind refinement. This kind of bread reveals labor. It tastes of grain more directly. It does not apologize for being close to the field. This is the bread for understanding beginnings. The fifth bread is an emmer and barley sourdough-style loaf. This one draws from ancient grain traditions and modern sourdough science. Emmer and barley were important in ancient Egyptian bread and beer worlds, and sourdough starter lets us explore living fermentation without claiming to reproduce an Egyptian loaf. Use 350 grams bread flour, 100 grams whole emmer flour, and 50 grams barley flour. Add 350 grams water, 100 grams active sourdough starter, and 10 grams salt. Mix the flour and water first if you like, then add starter and salt. Let the dough ferment, folding gently over several hours. Shape it, let it rise, and bake it fully. Because barley has less gluten than wheat, it will not behave like a pure white bread flour loaf. It may feel denser, more fragrant, more grain-forward. That is part of the lesson. Different grains speak differently. Modern bread often asks every loaf to be tall, pale, soft, and predictable. Older grain breads remind us that food once carried more local character. The grain available, the millstone used, the water added, the fuel burned, the hand that shaped it, and the patience allowed. These 5 breads are not museum reconstructions. They are bridges. The emmer and barley loaf is perhaps the most poetic of the 5, but it also needs the most patient handling. Ancient grains are not a costume. They are ingredients with their own behavior. Emmer can bring flavor and history into a dough, but it does not behave exactly like strong modern bread flour. Barley contributes aroma and old-world feeling, but it does not build the same gluten network as wheat. Too much barley can make a loaf heavy. That is why the suggested formula keeps bread flour in the mix. It lets the loaf rise while still letting older grains speak. This is an honest compromise. It is not pure reconstruction. It is modern bread with historical memory. When a sourdough version ferments, the starter works through the dough slowly. The acids develop. The grain softens. The smell deepens. A dough that seemed plain at mixing can become complex by the next day. This bread is best introduced with humility. Try it, watch it, adjust it, learn from it. That is how bread teaches. It does not give the same answer in every kitchen. Humidity matters. Flour matters. Starter strength matters. Room temperature matters. The baker's hand matters. Even the bowl and schedule matter. There is freedom in that, once we stop demanding that every loaf be perfect. A dense loaf can still be meaningful. A cracked crust can still be beautiful. A slightly uneven crumb can still taste like care. This is the bread for understanding continuity. They let a listener or home baker feel the difference between speed and time, flat and risen, white and whole, commercial yeast and living starter, familiar bread and strange bread. And perhaps that is enough. Not every historical lesson has to be exact in the mouth. Sometimes it is enough to know what is exact in the record, and then cook honestly beside it. That phrase is worth holding near the end of these recipes. Cook honestly beside the record. It protects us from two mistakes. The first mistake is to flatten the past into fantasy, pretending that a modern kitchen can reproduce a lost world exactly. The second mistake is to keep the past so far away that it cannot be touched at all. Between those mistakes is a generous middle path. We can say, here is what the evidence shows, here is what it does not show, and here is a modern bread that helps us think with our hands. That is a very sleepy cat approach, really. Quiet facts, gentle imagination, no false certainty, and a warm loaf at the end. Bread is a good teacher because it is humble. It does not arrive as a jewel. It does not gleam like metal or tower like stone. It sits on a table, softening in the air, and yet, behind it, nearly the whole human story gathers. Bread asks us to think about transformation. The field does not look like the loaf. The grain does not look like flour. The flour does not look like dough. The dough does not look like bread. At each stage, something is lost and something is gained. The stalk is cut, the seed is ground, the flour is wetted, the dough is heated, the starter is fed by removing part of itself. The final loaf is made by ending the earlier forms. That sounds severe, but it is also ordinary. Most things become useful by changing. Most lives do too. Bread also asks us to think about patience. A fast bread can be wonderful. A flat bread can be ready in minutes. A biscuit can rise in the heat almost as soon as it is mixed. But the breads that most invite meditation are often slow, the dough resting overnight, the sourdough starter gathering strength, the long fermentation developing flavor that cannot be hurried without becoming something else. This is not only baking advice, it is a philosophy of time. Some parts of life can be accelerated, some cannot. You can heat an oven faster. You can buy flour already milled. You can use commercial yeast. But you cannot make slow fermentation be slow fermentation without giving it time. The word starter is beautiful for this reason. It is not the finished thing. It is a beginning that survives by beginning again. Every feeding says, continue. Every loaf says, use some of what was kept, and keep some for what comes next. Bread also asks us to think about community. A single person can bake a loaf, but bread easily multiplies into sharing. It is broken, sliced, passed, dipped, traded, given, packed, blessed, sold, and saved. In many traditions, to share bread is not merely to share calories, it is to recognize another person's hunger as real. That may be why bread words become moral words. Companion comes from the idea of one with whom bread is shared. Livelihood becomes daily bread. Hospitality appears as a loaf set before a visitor. Even in hardship, bread can become the measure of care. But bread is not sentimental only. It has also been the food of rationing, scarcity, punishment, tax, and unrest. When bread fails, politics trembles. When bread prices rise, households feel it immediately. When a ruler promises bread, the promise is intimate. It reaches the stomach before it reaches the mind. So bread sits between comfort and power. It is soft and it is serious. It is domestic and it is political. It is ordinary and it is sacred. The long history of bread is therefore not only the history of food. It is the history of how humans learn to depend on invisible processes. Seeds germinating underground, yeast fermenting in dough, heat moving through a loaf, communities trusting measures, families trusting tomorrow's flour. Bread is faith made practical. You sow without seeing the harvest. You grind without yet tasting the loaf. You feed a starter before it can feed you. You put dough into an oven and trust that heat will complete what your hands began. That is why bread belongs so naturally at night. At night, we also give ourselves to processes we do not fully control. We lie down, we close our eyes, the mind sorts itself, the body repairs, time passes through us quietly. Sleep is not unlike fermentation. Something works while we stop. Something deepens when we leave it alone. So perhaps tonight's loaf is not only a loaf, it is a reminder that rest is also a form of making. Bread also teaches proportion. Too much water, and the dough becomes difficult to shape. Too little water, and it becomes tight. Too little salt, and flavor flattens. Too much salt, and fermentation slows. Too much heat, and the crust burns before the inside is ready. Too little heat, and the loaf dries without becoming itself. The baker is always balancing forces. This is why bread feels philosophical without needing to announce itself as philosophy. It is a daily lesson in proportion, patience, attention, and acceptance. You can guide dough, but you cannot dominate it completely. You can plan a schedule, but fermentation may ask for more time. You can shape a loaf, but it will open in the oven according to tensions you partly created and partly inherited. Bread invites control, then gently corrects it. It says, "Work with me, not against me." This is an old lesson for human beings. Much of life is like that. We do not make everything from nothing. We participate in processes already larger than us. Weather, soil, bodies, communities, memory, sleep, grief, healing, love, hunger, and time. Bread is a small, edible version of that larger truth. It is also a lesson in enough. A good loaf does not need to be perfect to nourish. It does not need a photograph. It does not need a dramatic score. It can simply be warm, torn open, and shared. In a world that constantly asks for display, bread remembers use. It is made to disappear into life. That may be why the carbonized Roman loaves are so haunting. They did not disappear. They were stopped. They were prevented from fulfilling their ordinary purpose. We look at them because they survived, but they were made to be eaten. The completed loaf wants to become energy, memory, conversation, comfort. It wants to leave the table by becoming part of the people around it. That is a beautiful destiny, to be made well, to be shared, to vanish into nourishment. Maybe rest can be like that too, not wasted time. Not absence, but a quiet transformation that helps tomorrow arrive with a little more strength. Bread also teaches memory through smell. The smell of bread is one of those ordinary experiences that can open a door in the mind. A person may remember a kitchen from childhood, a bakery passed on a cold morning, a grandparent's table, a school lunch, a holiday loaf, a camping flatbread, or toast made late at night when the house was quiet. Smell does not explain itself. It simply arrives, and the past comes with it. This is fitting, because bread is itself a memory food. It remembers the field as flour. It remembers the mill as texture. It remembers the starter as flavor. It remembers the oven as crust. It remembers the baker's timing and the shape of its crumb. Every loaf is a record, though not a written one. A tight crumb may remember too little water, too little fermentation, or hard handling. A blistered crust may remember steam. A sour aroma may remember a long cold rest. A dense slice may remember whole grain, weak gluten, or a young starter. A beautifully open crumb may remember time, folding, hydration, and heat in good proportion. The loaf is an archive you can eat. This is why bread making can become comforting even when the results are imperfect. The baker learns to read traces. A loaf that did not rise well still teaches. A loaf that spread too much teaches. A crust that darkened too quickly teaches. Nothing is wasted if attention remains. History works similarly. The past rarely gives us a perfect loaf. It gives fragments, charred remains, broken tools, models from tombs, legal records, museum objects, cuneiform tablets, later memories. Scientific studies. We gather them carefully, not to force them into a perfect shape, but to learn what kind of dough history has given us. That is a lovely metaphor, but it is also a discipline. Too much imagination, and the loaf collapses. Too little imagination, and it never rises. The historian, like the baker, needs proportion. Evidence gives structure. Imagination gives warmth. The quiet facts are the flour. Time lets them become something a listener can hold. Bread also asks us to think about hands. Modern life is full of surfaces we touch without consequence. Glass screens, smooth counters, plastic packaging, metal handles, steering wheels, keys. Bread dough is different. It responds. It sticks, stretches, resists, relaxes, tears, smooths, and changes temperature under the hand. It makes touch meaningful again. The hand learns how soft is too soft. How firm is too firm. How a rested dough differs from a strained one. How flour dries the surface. How water loosens it. How oil changes the feel. How whole grain makes the dough slightly rougher. How sourdough feels elastic when it is alive and ready. This knowledge is difficult to reduce to words, but it is real knowledge. It belongs to bakers across centuries. It belongs to people who never wrote a cookbook, never published a formula, never entered a museum catalog, and yet knew exactly when a dough felt right. The history of bread is therefore also a history of unnamed expertise. That is worth saying gently. So much of food history was carried by people whose names were not preserved. Women in households, enslaved workers, servants, millers, field laborers, monastery bakers, market sellers, mothers, fathers, children, travelers, soldiers, sailors, and countless ordinary hands doing necessary work. The famous dates help us organize the story. 23,000 years ago at Ohalo II for grain processing, 14,400 years ago at Shubaika I for bread-like remains, about 10,000 years ago for wheat domestication in the Fertile Crescent, about 1981 to 1975 BC for the Mequetrefe bakery and brewery model, about 1400 BC for Egyptian evidence of yeast in bread, AD 79 for carbonized Roman bread from the Vesuvian cities, 1266 for the English assize of bread and ale, 1928 for Rohwedder's effective bread slicing machine, the 1940s for American enrichment policy, and the early 1960s for Chorleywood-style industrial bread making. But between all those dates are hands. Hands sewing, hands cutting, hands carrying, hands grinding, hands mixing, hands feeding starter, hands opening ovens, hands breaking bread. That is the human continuity beneath the timeline. Bread also teaches us about enoughness. Modern food culture can make bread complicated. Hydration percentages, fermentation schedules, flour extraction rates, scoring patterns, steam systems, crumb analysis, heritage grains, long cold proofs, and beautiful photographs. All of that can be interesting. Some of it is genuinely useful. But bread does not have to be impressive to be meaningful. A plain flat bread is enough. A simple slice of toast is enough. A rough homemade loaf is enough. A roll beside soup is enough. A piece of bread given to someone hungry is more than enough. The long history of bread returns again and again to this modest truth. Food does not have to be perfect to be generous. That may be the deepest philosophy of bread. Bread is made to be shared before it is made to be admired. This is also why bread belongs beside stories. For most of human life, food and storytelling were not as separate as they can feel now. People talked while working. They remembered while grinding. They passed along instruction while mixing, shaping, and watching fire. A recipe could be a measurement, but it could also be a memory. Add enough water until it feels right. Wait until it smells ready. Bake until the crust sounds hollow. Make it the way your mother did. Make it the way the village baker does. Make it the way the festival requires. Bread knowledge travels in stories because not everything important fits into numbers. Numbers matter. Our modern recipes need grams, temperatures, and safety rules. But bread also needs comparison, image, and memory. Sticky but not wet. Risen until doubled. Brown as chestnuts. Cool before slicing. These phrases are small bridges between technical knowledge and human feeling. That is what this quiet story can be too. A bridge between archaeology and kitchen, between cuneiform tablet and cutting board, between Egyptian bakery model and modern starter jar, between the AD 79 Roman loaf and the square slice in a toaster, between hunger and philosophy, between wakefulness and sleep. If the listener remembers nothing else, they might remember this. Bread is ordinary because it succeeded. It became so useful, so repeatable, so adaptable, and so beloved that it entered the background of life. It became easy to overlook because it had become dependable. But when we look again, it is astonishing. A grass seed became a civilization food. A paste became a loaf became law, a law became memory, a memory became comfort, and comfort tonight becomes rest. And now, as our long path through bread begins to settle, we can let the story become quiet again. We have followed wild grains beside ancient water. We have paused at Ohalo I, around 14,400 years ago, where bread-like food appeared before agriculture. We have watched farming make grain a daily companion. We have passed through Mesopotamian tablets without turning them into recipes they are not. We have stood beside Egyptian bakeries and breweries, careful with the evidence for yeast by about 1400 BC. We have looked at Roman bread preserved by the AD 79 eruption of Vesuvius. We have entered medieval streets where bread could show class, law, hunger, and survival. We have moved through mills, commercial yeast, sliced bread in 1928, enrichment in the 1940s, and the early 1960s industrial processes that changed the speed of the modern loaf. And then we returned quietly to a jar of starter. Flour, water, time. The simplest things, still asking for care. As the narration fades, imagine a warm kitchen after everyone has gone to bed. The counter has been wiped clean. A loaf rests under a cloth. Somewhere nearby, a starter sits loosely covered, breathing in its small way. The room is dim. The house is safe. Outside, the world turns through its long night. There is nothing more you need to hold. The grain has been gathered. The flour has been mixed. The dough has rested. The bread has baked. And now you may rest too. Let the last image be simple. Not a feast. Not a crowded market. Not a dramatic oven roaring in the dark. Just a quiet place after bread has been made. Maybe there is a wooden table. Maybe there is a cloth over a loaf. Maybe a jar of starter sits nearby, marked with a small line where it rose earlier in the evening. Maybe a few crumbs remain near the knife. Maybe a bowl has been turned upside down to dry. The next work can wait. The grain has already done what grain does. The flour has already become dough. The dough has already become bread. The bread has already become memory. And if some of the loaf remains until morning, it will greet the day in a humbler form. Toast, crumb, breakfast, daily bread. There is a peacefulness in that cycle. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be solved tonight. The old story of bread can keep unfolding without you holding every part of it. Ohalo II can rest by the lake. Sourdough I can rest in the northeastern Jordanian night. The Egyptian bakery can bank its coals. The Roman oven can cool. The medieval market can empty. The mill can stop turning. The factory lights can dim. The starter can sleep in the refrigerator until it is needed again, and you can sleep too. As the music and ambient sound continue, let the facts drift into softer shapes: grain, stone, water, fire, hands, time, bread. Each word can become a step down into rest. And if the mind is still awake, it can settle on the simplest chain: seed to field, field to grain, grain to flour, flour to dough, dough to bread. Bread to table, table to memory, memory to sleep. Nothing in that chain needs to hurry. Each step has its own pace. The seed waits underground. The field waits for rain. The grain waits in storage. The flour waits in the bowl. The dough waits beneath cloth. The bread waits to cool. The table waits for hands. And the body, at the end of the day, waits for rest. This is why bread is such a gentle companion for nighttime. It does not ask us to conquer the past. It asks us to notice how much care was hidden inside ordinary survival. It asks us to honor the people who ground grain before dawn, who watched ovens, who carried loaves, who saved starter, who stretched flour through hard weeks, who fed children, workers, travelers, households, and strangers. It asks us to remember that civilization was built not only by rulers and wars, but by repeated nourishment. A loaf is a small thing. But small things, repeated long enough, become worlds. So tonight, let the world become small again. Small as a seed, small as a crumb, small as one slow breath, small enough to rest in. And perhaps that is the final kindness of bread. It takes what is scattered and gathers it. Seeds scattered across grasses become harvest. Harvest becomes sacks. Sacks become flour. Flour becomes dough. Dough becomes one loaf. The loaf is a gathering. In the same way, a quiet night can gather the scattered pieces of a day. Thoughts that felt loose and noisy can soften. Worries that seem sharp can lose their edges. The mind can stop milling for a while. The body can stop carrying its invisible sacks. You do not have to finish every unfinished thing before rest becomes allowed. Bread itself is made through pauses. Resting the dough is part of the work. Feeding the starter and leaving it alone is part of the work. So rest is not a failure of motion. It is one of the conditions that lets transformation continue. Tonight, the long history of bread can become very simple. People were hungry, people paid attention, people learned from grain, people shared what they made, and across thousands of years, through uncertainty, invention, hardship, comfort, labor, law, industry, and memory, bread remained close to the human hand. Close enough to pass, close enough to bless, close enough to become part of the body, and then part of the story. The story is complete enough for tonight. The loaf is complete enough for tonight. You are complete enough for tonight. So let the room grow quiet. Let the breath settle. Let the old human work of bread fade into the older human work of sleep. And when the morning comes, somewhere in the world, someone will begin again, opening a flour bag, warming a pan, feeding a starter, cutting a slice, sharing a piece, and continuing the long, quiet history of bread.